The Shadow Presidents, Power Behind the White House Curtains. Opening hook. What if the most powerful person in America wasn't the president? What if history's greatest decisions, the ones that shaped wars, economies, and empires, were made not in the Oval Office, but in whispered conversations behind its curtains? This is the story of the Shadow Presidents, the men and women who, from behind the scenes, steered the destiny of the United States. 1. The hidden hand of history. From the very birth of the Republic, America has loved the myth of the strong, solitary leader. Washington crossing the Delaware, Lincoln saving the Union, Roosevelt leading through depression and war. But behind every great president stood a hidden hand, someone who advised, edited, or quietly commanded decisions that would define a nation. Even George Washington, often remembered as a solitary hero, relied heavily on his Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, a man whose words often shaped the very policies the president signed. Hamilton's influence was so vast that Thomas Jefferson once warned, "The Treasury is in the hands of a monarchist." In the 19th century, another kind of shadow emerged, the kitchen cabinet of Andrew Jackson. Unofficial, unelected, yet immensely powerful. This secret group of advisors met in the White House kitchen after hours, steering Jackson's populist crusade while Congress fumed in the dark. By the dawn of the 20th century, the machinery of American power had evolved. Presidents were no longer lone commanders. They were surrounded by strategists, fixers, and deal makers. As one journalist wrote in 1908, "A president rules by his advisors as a king by his court." And then came one of the strangest chapters in American history, the time when the country was secretly ruled by a first lady. 2. Edith Wilson, the first female president who wasn't. In October 1919, President Woodrow Wilson collapsed in his White House bedroom. A massive stroke left him paralyzed on his left side and half blind. Doctors feared he might not survive. The nation, still reeling from World War I and the Spanish flu, was suddenly without a leader. But the crisis never reached the public. Instead, a remarkable deception began, one orchestrated by Edith Wilson, the president's wife. She locked the White House doors, dismissed cabinet members she didn't trust, and restricted access to her husband entirely. Even Vice President Thomas Marshall was left in the dark. When senators demanded to see the president, Edith simply claimed, "The president is resting and cannot be disturbed." In truth, she became the gatekeeper of the United States government. Every document, bill, and diplomatic note passed through her hands. She decided which matters the president would see and which she would resolve herself. For 17 months, from 1919 to 1921, Edith Wilson effectively ran the country. She approved appointments, dictated messages, and oversaw the post-war peace negotiations, all under the guise of merely assisting her husband. Historians would later debate her role. Was it loyalty or a coup? But the fact remains, the United States, for the first and only time, had an unelected female president ruling from behind the curtains of the White House. When Wilson's term ended, Edith quietly stepped back into obscurity. Yet her secret reign left a haunting precedent: the realization that power could exist unseen, wrapped in silence and devotion. 3. The puppeteers of the Cold War. The end of World War II brought America to a new kind of battlefield, one fought not with bullets, but with secrets. The Cold War turned the White House into a chessboard, and the real players were often the men who never appeared in front of cameras. Chief among them was Allen Dulles, the first civilian director of the CIA. Smooth-talking, brilliant, and utterly ruthless, Dulles shaped U.S. foreign policy more than any president he served. He orchestrated coups in Iran, 1953, and Guatemala, 1954. Not with presidential orders, but with his own conviction that America must rule the global game. When President Eisenhower was asked years later about the operations, he smiled thinly and said, "I never knew half of what Allen was doing." In the 1960s, during Kennedy's Camelot, the intelligence community grew even darker. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion, a CIA plan to overthrow Fidel Castro, was launched on Dulles' command. When it collapsed, Kennedy was humiliated on the world stage. Furious, he fired Dulles, but the shadows lingered. 2 years later, when Kennedy was assassinated, Allen Dulles quietly returned, this time as a member of the Warren Commission, investigating the very event that removed his former adversary. It was as if the puppeteer had stepped back onto the stage to rearrange the story. Meanwhile, other unelected figures, the Bundy brothers, Dean Acheson, George Kennan, became the architects of America's global posture. They crafted doctrines, planned wars, and set policies that would outlast the presidents who signed them. The Cold War taught the United States a dangerous truth. Sometimes continuity of power mattered more than democracy itself. 5. The secret cabinet, Nixon, Kissinger, and the real decisions of power. By the 1970s, the curtain between presidency and shadow had nearly vanished. And no pair embodied that duality more than Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. Kissinger, brilliant, Machiavellian, and utterly confident, was technically just an advisor. But inside the West Wing, he was known as the co-president. Together, Nixon and Kissinger reshaped global order, opening China, ending the Vietnam War, and redrawing the balance of power with the Soviet Union. But as Nixon became consumed by paranoia and Watergate scandal, Kissinger quietly seized control of foreign policy. While the president brooded in isolation, Kissinger met with world leaders, negotiated treaties, and even conducted bombing campaigns in Cambodia and Laos without congressional approval. He once told a reporter, "The illegal we do immediately. The unconstitutional takes a little longer." When Nixon finally resigned in 1974, Kissinger didn't flinch. He remained in office under President Ford, a seamless continuity of power. The world barely noticed the transition because the shadow had already learned how to survive presidents. Even decades later, Kissinger's influence never faded. His protégés and philosophy still guide U.S. diplomacy. He proved that the office of power could be detached from the office of the presidency, and that true authority often lives in continuity, not elections. 6. Modern shadows, the unelected architects of today's America. In the 21st century, the shadows have only grown more sophisticated. They no longer wear suits in smoky rooms. They exist in data, in algorithms, in corporations that shape global policy more effectively than Congress ever could. When 9/11 struck, the new shadow presidents emerged not as politicians, but as security czars. Figures like Dick Cheney, who transformed the vice presidency into a command center. Cheney personally approved drone strikes, surveillance programs, and wartime policies that many congressmen never even read. Behind him stood the private defense contractors, intelligence analysts, and Silicon Valley firms that made the machinery of power possible. By the 2010s, technology giants like Google, Amazon, and Palantir began working directly with U.S. agencies. Algorithms now decide everything from immigration risk to counterterrorism priorities. Meanwhile, political megadomers, billionaires who fund campaigns and shape narratives, hold influence rivaling entire government branches. Decisions that affect millions are often discussed not in Congress, but at closed-door meetings in Davos or on encrypted channels in Washington think tanks. The shadow presidents of today are not always individuals. They are systems, economic, digital, and institutional. They don't overthrow power, they stabilize it, ensuring that no matter who occupies the Oval Office, certain interests remain untouched. And perhaps that's the ultimate illusion of modern democracy, the idea that change comes with elections when in truth the machinery beneath barely shifts at all.
Edith Wilson, the first female president who wasn't. What if I told you the United States once had a woman president decades before women could even vote? It wasn't a headline or a secret amendment or a revolution. It happened quietly, behind the closed doors of the White House, when the most powerful man in the country was too weak to speak and his wife took control of the nation. This is the astonishing true story of Edith Wilson, the First Lady who secretly became America's first female president. A love story that became a political revolution. When Edith Bowling Galt met President Woodrow Wilson in 1915, Washington society was scandalized. Wilson's first wife, Ellen, had died just a year earlier, and the country was still mourning. Edith was elegant, confident, and widowed, a jewelry shop owner who never imagined she'd step into the world's most powerful household. Yet, within months, they fell in love. Wilson wrote her passionate letters daily, sometimes 3 in a single afternoon. He confessed that she was not just his companion, but his minister of happiness. When they married later that year, the public softened. The war in Europe was escalating, and the president's new bride projected grace and calm. Behind that composure, however, was an intelligent woman with sharp instincts. She had a quiet understanding of people and power, and Wilson trusted her completely. By 1917, as America entered World War I, Edith was already more than a first lady. She attended cabinet meetings, reviewed diplomatic reports, and sometimes gave her opinion on military decisions. Even his closest advisors noticed. One remarked privately, "She is the only person whose advice he never questions." But no one, not even Edith, could have imagined what would happen 2 years later. The stroke that broke the presidency. In October 1919, after months of exhausting travel promoting the League of Nations, President Wilson's body finally gave out. He collapsed in the White House after a severe stroke, paralyzed on his left side, partially blind, and barely conscious. Doctors rushed in, horrified at the severity of his condition. The President of the United States could not walk, write, or even properly speak. The Vice President, Thomas Marshall, waited anxiously for news, but none came. Because Edith Wilson had made a decision that would change history. She ordered absolute secrecy. Wilson's personal physician, Dr. Cary Grayson, was instructed not to tell the cabinet or the public the full truth. Instead, the White House released vague statements. The president is resting. The president is improving. But inside those white walls, the government of the United States was in chaos. The gatekeeper of a nation. As Wilson lay in bed, partially paralyzed, Edith Wilson stepped into a role no First Lady had ever taken before. She became the gatekeeper of the presidency. Every piece of paper that required the president's attention, bills, treaties, military orders, correspondence, was delivered directly to her. She decided what he would see, what could wait, and what she would handle herself. In her own words, written later in her memoir, My Memoir, Edith described it innocently. "I merely decided what was important and what was not, and when matters should be presented to my husband." But historians would later say that was the understatement of the century. Because for 17 months, Edith Wilson effectively ran the executive branch of the United States. She signed documents in his name. She issued instructions to cabinet members. She reviewed legislative proposals, military dispatches, and international cables. If a secretary or senator wanted to see the president, they had to go through her first, and most were denied. She wasn't just protecting her husband's health, she was preserving his power. The country that didn't know. Outside the White House, rumors began to swirl. Newspaper editors whispered that the president was gravely ill. Senators suspected a cover-up. Even foreign diplomats quietly expressed confusion. Why had no one seen or heard from the president in months? In the corridors of Congress, Vice President Thomas Marshall considered invoking the constitutional process to assume power. But he hesitated. Edith, through intermediaries, assured him that the president was recovering and that all affairs of state are proceeding normally. Marshall, wary of being accused of a coup, backed down. And so the illusion continued. Bills were passed, policies were approved, and America functioned, outwardly, under a president who could barely sign his own name. Behind the scenes, the First Lady reviewed foreign policy memos, military appointments, and domestic legislation. She was careful never to issue directives officially, but everyone in the administration knew that nothing reached the president's desk without her consent. In effect, she was acting as commander-in-chief, the only unelected woman in American history to do so. The League of Nations crisis. The greatest test of Edith Wilson's hidden presidency came with the fight over the League of Nations, President Wilson's dream of a global peace alliance after World War I. The Senate, led by powerful Republican Henry Cabot Lodge, refused to ratify the treaty. They argued that joining the League would erode U.S. sovereignty. Wilson, bedridden and barely able to speak, was desperate to defend it, but it was Edith who decided what he could and couldn't handle. When aides begged her to let them brief the president on critical Senate developments, she refused. She believed the stress could kill him. Instead, she personally read the reports and summarized them for Wilson, often filtering or softening the bad news. Some historians argue that if she had allowed full transparency, the treaty might have been renegotiated and saved. But Edith saw herself as her husband's protector, not as a politician. And in trying to shield him, she inadvertently doomed his greatest dream. In March 1920, the Senate officially rejected the treaty. The League of Nations went forward without U.S. participation. For the first time, America had withdrawn from world leadership, and the decision was made under a presidency run from a sick room. The women who knew the secret. Inside the White House, a small group of people knew the truth. Dr. Grayson, Wilson's physician, Chief Usher Ike Hoover, and the President's Secretary Joe Tumulty. They helped Edith maintain the illusion that Wilson was functioning. Hoover later wrote in his memoir, 42 Years in the White House, Mrs. Wilson was the president's closest advisor, and for a time, the government of the United States was in fact run by her. Even visiting dignitaries were fooled. When foreign ambassadors came to meet the president, Edith would arrange for them to speak to him briefly in his dimly lit bedroom, where he would nod faintly and say a few slurred words. They would leave convinced that he was merely recovering. No one realized that the man in the bed was no longer governing, and that the woman beside him was silently steering the republic. The first female president. By the time Woodrow Wilson's term ended in March 1921, he was a shadow of the man who had entered office 8 years earlier. He could not run for re-election. The country moved on. But history had been quietly rewritten. For nearly a year and a half, the executive power of the United States had rested in the hands of Edith Bowling Wilson, a woman who had no title, no mandate, and no constitutional authority. When journalists later asked her if she considered herself the first woman president, she laughed and said, "I never made a single decision myself. I only tried to do what my husband would have done." But those who served under her knew better. A senator who visited the White House in early 1920 remarked privately, "Mrs. Wilson is the president. She runs everything but the cabinet meetings, and sometimes those too." In modern terms, she had created what scholars now call the stewardship of power, a silent, unelected regency that kept the government running under the illusion of stability. The puppeteers of the Cold War, the hidden men who shaped the world. Power is not always visible. Sometimes it hides behind the curtain, whispering orders no one dares to question. When Americans think of the Cold War, they picture presidents: Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Nixon. But the truth is, some of the most consequential decisions of that dangerous era were made not in the Oval Office, but in smoke-filled backrooms, secret boardrooms, and heavily guarded CIA offices where unelected men wielded power like puppeteers. These were the shadow presidents, men whose influence stretched far beyond their titles. They shaped coups, toppled governments, and designed policies that altered the global balance of power, all in the name of protecting freedom. Their names rarely made headlines, but their fingerprints are everywhere. Allen Dulles, McGeorge Bundy, Robert McNamara, John Foster Dulles, and a few powerful industrialists who turned fear into profit. This is the untold story of how America's Cold War was engineered, not just by presidents, but by the men who quietly controlled them. The rise of the invisible empire. The Cold War didn't start with bombs, it started with paranoia. In 1947, the same year the CIA was created, the United States was still reeling from World War II. The Soviet Union was expanding across Eastern Europe, and fear gripped Washington. If America didn't act fast, democracy itself might crumble. That fear gave birth to the national security state, a vast and secretive network of agencies and advisors that would soon operate beyond congressional oversight. Its architects understood something chilling, that secrecy was power. One of those architects was Allen Dulles, a Princeton-educated lawyer turned spy master. Dulles had run secret operations in Switzerland during World War II, charming diplomats and recruiting spies with a glass of scotch in hand. He believed in one idea above all: America must control the world's hidden levers before someone else does. When President Dwight D. Eisenhower appointed him as Director of Central Intelligence in 1953, Dulles became the most powerful unelected man in Washington. The CIA, under his watch, turned into a machine of global manipulation. The coup factory. In 1953, the first major act of the Dulles era unfolded in the oil-rich nation of Iran. Its democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, had made a bold move. He nationalized Iran's oil, taking it from British and American corporations. To Dulles and his brother, John Foster Dulles, then Secretary of State, that was unforgivable. In their eyes, Mossadegh was not a nationalist. He was a communist threat. With Eisenhower's quiet approval, the CIA launched Operation Ajax. Using propaganda, bribes, and street mobs, Dulles's agents overthrew Mossadegh and restored the Shah to power. It was America's first Cold War coup, and it worked perfectly. Oil flowed again, Western companies profited, and the world never knew how deeply Washington's hand was involved. But the success was addictive. Just 1 year later, Dulles used the same playbook in Guatemala, toppling President Jacobo Arbenz for daring to challenge the United Fruit Company, an American corporation with deep ties to U.S. elites. In less than 2 years, two nations had been transformed, not by war, but by invisible power. McGeorge Bundy and the Harvard Cold Warriors. As the 1960s dawned, a new kind of shadow power emerged: intellectual, polished, and ruthless. McGeorge Bundy, a brilliant but cold strategist from Harvard, became National Security Advisor under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. He was young, charming, and terrifyingly confident, the perfect Cold War bureaucrat. He believed the world was a chessboard, and America had to move first. Bundy surrounded himself with what journalists later called the best and the brightest. They were economists, military strategists, and academic elites who treated global politics like a math problem. But their calculations came with real-world consequences. From Vietnam to Cuba, millions would pay the price. It was Bundy, not Kennedy, who first pushed for aggressive military action in Vietnam. It was Bundy who helped escalate the conflict after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, a questionable attack that many historians now believe was exaggerated or even fabricated. When Kennedy hesitated about sending troops, Bundy whispered about credibility, that if America didn't act, the Soviets would see weakness. By 1965, under Lyndon Johnson, Bundy's policies had turned Vietnam into a full-scale war. The military-industrial puppeteers. Behind the scenes, the Pentagon and defense contractors were thriving. Companies like Lockheed, General Dynamics, and Northrop were producing weapons faster than ever. Each missile built meant more money, more jobs, more votes. The Cold War had become a business, and fear was the marketing strategy. In a haunting farewell address in 1961, President Eisenhower, a general himself, warned of this growing danger. He called it the military-industrial complex. He knew that as long as fear of communism persisted, the machine would keep running, and those profiting from it would never let it stop. Behind the curtain, intelligence and industry had fused into something unprecedented, a self-sustaining empire of secrecy. Allen Dulles' CIA orchestrated coups. McGeorge Bundy crafted strategy, and corporations built the weapons that made those strategies real. It was a triangle of power, and presidents often found themselves trapped inside it. Kennedy's rebellion and the price of defiance. In 1961, a young President John F. Kennedy tried to challenge that shadow network. He distrusted the CIA after the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion, a failed attempt to overthrow Cuba's Fidel Castro that had been planned under Eisenhower but executed under Kennedy. Kennedy was furious. He reportedly said, "I want to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds." But he couldn't. The CIA had grown too powerful, too secret, too untouchable. Allen Dulles was forced to resign, but his influence lingered. After Kennedy's assassination in 1963, Dulles quietly returned to Washington. Astonishingly, he was appointed to serve on the Warren Commission, the official investigation into the president's death, the very system he once helped build, investigating one of its own. To many historians, that appointment symbolizes the true depth of shadow power during the Cold War. Even when removed, the puppeteers found a way to pull the strings again. The legacy of shadows. Today, decades after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the ghosts of that invisible empire still linger. The intelligence community has grown larger than ever, and private contractors handle much of what used to be top-secret government work. The line between national security and private profit remains blurred. Surveillance, cyber warfare, and influence operations have replaced coups and assassinations, but the principle is the same: controlled from the shadows. The men of the Cold War believed they were protecting America. Perhaps they were. But they also created a parallel government, one that operated in secrecy, without accountability, driven by the belief that democracy was too fragile to handle the truth. Epilogue: the price of secrecy. Looking back, historians often ask, who truly ruled the United States during the Cold War? Was it Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, or the men like Dulles, Bundy, and McNamara, whose decisions shaped the battlefield before presidents even saw the map? The Cold War ended without nuclear annihilation, but it left behind something equally powerful: a permanent security apparatus and a culture of secrecy that still defines Washington today. The puppeteers of the Cold War may be gone, but the stage they built still stands. The strings have changed hands, yet the performance continues.
The secret cabinet, Nixon, Kissinger, and the real decisions of power. Sometimes the most powerful man in the room isn't the one sitting in the Oval Office. In the early 1970s, while the American public was fixated on the Watergate scandal, the break-in, the tapes, and the downfall of President Richard Nixon, another, even more secret story was unfolding behind closed doors.
It was a drama of power, deception, and diplomacy that reshaped the world order, not through votes or speeches, but through whispered phone calls and late-night decisions made by one unelected man. His name was Henry Kissinger. And for nearly a decade, he acted as something far greater than an advisor. He was, in effect, America's secret president. The making of a shadow president. Henry Kissinger was not born into power, he built it. A German Jewish refugee who fled Nazi persecution, he arrived in America in 1938 with little more than a heavy accent and an obsession with power. At Harvard, he dazzled professors with his intellect and published works on foreign policy that caught the attention of Washington's elite. By the late 1960s, America was drowning in chaos. The Vietnam War, civil unrest, and a crisis of confidence in leadership. Nixon needed someone who could navigate the storm, a man of brilliance, cunning, and loyalty. Kissinger was that man. But Nixon didn't just find an advisor, he found a kindred spirit. Both were deeply secretive, distrustful of the press, and convinced that history favored strong men willing to act in the shadows. Together, they would remake American foreign policy, not through open debate, but through a secret cabinet that often excluded even the State Department, Congress, and the Pentagon. The secret war in Cambodia. By 1969, the Vietnam War had become America's open wound. The public demanded peace. Nixon promised an honorable end. But behind the curtain, Kissinger and Nixon launched Operation Menu, a series of secret bombings in Cambodia, a neutral country officially uninvolved in the war. Without congressional approval, American B-52s dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs on suspected communist hideouts. The operations were hidden from the press, disguised in military paperwork, and even kept secret from much of the U.S. government. When the truth later emerged, Kissinger brushed it off as necessary to shorten the war. But historians now estimate that tens of thousands of civilians were killed, and that the chaos helped ignite the rise of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, one of the most brutal regimes in modern history. For Kissinger, the ends always justified the means. He was crafting a new kind of diplomacy, one that existed above the law, justified by the belief that ordinary people could never understand the burdens of global power. Ping pong and power plays, the China opening. Then, in 1971, Kissinger pulled off one of the greatest diplomatic coups in history, one so secret that even the vice president didn't know about it. While the world watched a simple table tennis match between American and Chinese players, Kissinger quietly boarded a plane to Beijing under the cover of night. He met with Premier Zhou Enlai, laying the groundwork for the historic 1972 visit by President Nixon to Chairman Mao Zedong. The United States and Communist China, once bitter enemies, began a relationship that would reshape global geopolitics. The shock was global. Kissinger had accomplished what generations of diplomats failed to do. He reopened the world's most populous nation to the West. But make no mistake, this was not democracy in action. This was two men, Nixon and Kissinger, remaking the world map in total secrecy, with almost no congressional oversight. It was diplomacy by deception, and it worked. The chessboard of détente. With China on America's side, Kissinger turned to his next masterpiece, détente with the Soviet Union. He believed that the Cold War could not be won through ideology or brute force, but through balance, a careful equilibrium of fear and respect. Kissinger's theory, called realpolitik, rejected moral ideals and focused purely on power. Nations, he said, act not out of right or wrong, but out of self-interest. So he negotiated directly with the Soviets, bypassing diplomats and committees. The result was a series of landmark treaties, including the SALT I, strategic arms limitation talks, that limited nuclear weapons for the first time. To the world, Nixon appeared as a brilliant statesman. But inside Washington, insiders whispered that it was Kissinger who wrote the lines and Nixon who simply delivered them. When the two men won the 1973 Nobel Peace Prize for ending the Vietnam War, Kissinger accepted his share, even though the war had not truly ended and peace was still a distant dream. Behind the applause was a haunting truth. Kissinger had become more powerful than the president himself. The wiretaps and the paranoia. But power breeds paranoia, and secrecy demands control. As the Watergate scandal began to unravel Nixon's presidency, Kissinger's influence only grew stronger. He controlled access to the president, filtered information, and even authorized wiretaps on journalists and staff members suspected of leaking information. In his mind, leaks were threats to national security, and his power depended on silence. When the Pentagon and the State Department began to question his authority, Kissinger simply bypassed them. He met foreign leaders privately, made decisions unilaterally, and kept transcripts of calls and memos locked away. Even senior officials began to whisper, "Who runs this country, the president or Henry Kissinger?" The fall of Nixon and the rise of Kissinger. As the Watergate tapes became public and Nixon's presidency began to collapse in 1974, one man's reputation somehow survived untouched: Kissinger's. While aides were indicted and allies turned against Nixon, Kissinger stood calm, untouchable. He had something no one else had: bipartisan respect. Democrats admired his intellect, Republicans needed his stability. When Gerald Ford took over after Nixon's resignation, he made one of his first decisions to keep Kissinger as both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, an unprecedented consolidation of power in one unelected man's hands. The shadow legacy. By the time he left office in 1977, Henry Kissinger had negotiated with nearly every major world leader, influenced wars and peace treaties, and left a trail of classified documents historians are still uncovering. Even decades later, Kissinger remained a figure of fascination and controversy, advising presidents, testifying before Congress, and quietly shaping global policy from behind the scenes. He became a symbol of the unelected power, a man who blurred the line between advisor and ruler, diplomacy and manipulation. Watergate destroyed Nixon, but Kissinger endured. He understood something Nixon never did, that in Washington, real power doesn't depend on votes. It depends on information, relationships, and the ability to make others believe you are indispensable. Epilogue: The Hidden Lesson. Today, the story of Nixon and Kissinger serves as a mirror for modern America, a reminder that the greatest dangers to democracy often come not from tyrants, but from those who govern in the shadows, convinced they know better than the people they serve. Kissinger once said, "Power is the ultimate aphrodisiac." And for a time, he possessed it more completely than any elected official in the free world. The Watergate tapes revealed the corruption of a presidency, but history reveals something even more unsettling: that while Nixon fell, the machinery of secrecy he and Kissinger built never truly disappeared.
Modern shadows, the unelected architects of today's America. Presidents change, power doesn't. It's the 21st century. The age of steel and smoke is over, but the shadows are still here. The smoke has turned digital, the factories have become data centers, and the new barons of America don't wear suits of soot, but hoodies and designer glasses. Once, men like Allen Dulles and Henry Kissinger ruled behind closed doors. Today, their descendants of power sit in corporate boardrooms, Pentagon war rooms, and Silicon Valley offices, quietly steering the destiny of the world's most powerful nation. They don't campaign, they don't debate, and most of them never face a vote. Yet they shape elections, wars, the economy, and even our thoughts through algorithms, contracts, and secrets that most citizens will never see. These are the modern shadow presidents, unelected architects of America's invisible empire. The post-Cold War mirage. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, America stood alone as the world's superpower. Politicians spoke of a new world order, promising peace, prosperity, and democracy spreading across the globe. But while the cameras focused on the presidents, another kind of power was quietly emerging: the fusion of intelligence, technology, and finance. The end of the Cold War didn't dissolve the national security state, it privatized it. Agencies like the CIA, NSA, and Pentagon began outsourcing surveillance, cyber operations, and data management to private contractors, names the public barely knew, like Booz Allen Hamilton, SAIC, and Palantir Technologies. These companies handled the most sensitive tasks of the U.S. government, but operated under private law, immune from public scrutiny. By the time the 21st century began, the lines between Washington and Wall Street had blurred completely. America hadn't dismantled its shadow government, it had upgraded it. 9/11 and the age of infinite secrecy. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 changed everything. Fear swept the nation, and Congress gave the executive branch unprecedented power through the Patriot Act, opening the floodgates for surveillance and data collection. But behind the patriotic speeches, a new alliance formed between intelligence agencies and Silicon Valley. The NSA needed to track billions of digital communications across the globe. Tech companies like Google, Facebook, and Microsoft had exactly what they needed: user data. In exchange for government contracts and quiet immunity, tech giants began cooperating with intelligence networks in ways the public would only learn years later through whistleblowers like Edward Snowden in 2013. What Snowden revealed was staggering. The NSA was running massive programs like PRISM, secretly collecting data from major tech platforms, including emails, calls, photos, and chats from millions of Americans, all in the name of national security. It was the modern version of the Cold War secret cabinet, only now the intelligence wasn't gathered through spies and dossiers, but through algorithms and cloud servers. And the puppet strings were digital. Silicon Valley, the new White House. Fast forward to the 2010s. Elections, once decided by debates and policies, were now being shaped by data. Invisible psychological fingerprints collected from social media. The 2016 election became a turning point. While the world debated Russia's involvement, a deeper revelation surfaced. Private data firms like Cambridge Analytica had harvested information from over 80 million Facebook users to craft hyper-targeted political propaganda. These digital architects didn't need to steal ballots. They could reshape beliefs, guiding what people saw, felt, and feared. And the companies behind them, Facebook, Twitter, and Google, had more influence over American opinion than any newspaper, any campaign, or even the government itself. By 2020, Silicon Valley wasn't just a place, it was an empire. CEOs could deplatform presidents, shape global narratives, and influence stock markets with a single tweet. In earlier eras, power was measured by tanks and oil. Now it was measured by data and code. The new shadow presidents weren't generals or spies. They were engineers, venture capitalists, and algorithm designers. The Pentagon's private army. While Silicon Valley built digital control, another shadow empire thrived in the real world: private military and intelligence contractors. After 9/11, companies like Blackwater, later rebranded as X and Academy, exploded in size. They were paid billions to fight wars, guard diplomats, and conduct covert missions, often with less oversight than the U.S. military itself. By 2010, private contractors outnumbered U.S. troops in Afghanistan.
In Iraq, they ran prisons, interrogated suspects, and even carried out combat operations, shielded from accountability by legal loopholes. Meanwhile, massive defense companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman became more powerful than many nations. Their executives rotated through Washington's revolving door, serving in the Pentagon one year and on corporate boards the next. Every drone strike, every weapons deal, every national security decision had a corporate price tag. The military-industrial complex Eisenhower once warned about had now evolved into a military-corporate intelligence nexus, too large to challenge and too invisible to see. The rise of the tech titans. In the same decade, another set of unelected giants emerged, the tech billionaires who reshaped not only America's economy, but its culture and politics. Jeff Bezos turned Amazon from a bookstore to a global infrastructure, running cloud servers that now power the CIA, the Pentagon, and much of the internet itself. Elon Musk became America's space contractor, building rockets for NASA and satellites for the U.S. military through SpaceX. Mark Zuckerberg became the world's gatekeeper of information, controlling what billions of people read and believe. And Peter Thiel, co-founder of PayPal and Palantir, positioned himself as the bridge between Silicon Valley and the intelligence community, building data mining platforms used by law enforcement and surveillance networks worldwide. These men were not elected, yet they controlled resources, technology, and information on a scale greater than most governments. In the new America, corporate power had merged with state power, creating a system where influence no longer required office, only access. The quiet coup of the 2020s. In 2020, as the world faced a pandemic, economic collapse, and political turmoil, the unelected architects of America stepped fully into the spotlight. Tech companies became the arbiters of truth. Defense contractors ran logistics for vaccine distribution. Private intelligence firms monitored protests and online movements. And while millions of Americans lost jobs, the combined wealth of billionaires rose by more than $1.5 trillion in a single year. It wasn't a coup in the traditional sense. There were no tanks in the streets, no generals on TV. This was a soft coup, conducted through data control, financial networks, and digital infrastructure. The modern shadows didn't need to seize the White House. They simply built a system where the presidency itself became one of many power centers, not the ultimate one. Who truly governs America? Ask yourself, who truly governs the United States today? Is it the elected officials we see on television, or the unelected network of CEOs, generals, and data lords who decide what we buy, read, and believe? When the NSA can spy on citizens, when social media can silence voices, when corporations can write laws through lobbying, can we still call it democracy? The Founding Fathers envisioned checks and balances, but in the 21st century, power has learned how to hide, not in smoke-filled rooms, but in algorithms, encrypted servers, and offshore accounts. The shadows have gone digital, and the curtain is now a screen. Epilogue: The New Republic of Data. 200 years ago, Thomas Jefferson warned that liberty required eternal vigilance. Today, that vigilance means more than watching politicians. It means understanding the unseen systems that shape our world. Because in this new America, presidents come and go, but the shadow presidents, the unelected architects of data, defense, and deception, remain. They don't need to control the White House. They already control the world beneath it. And until the people demand transparency, the Republic of Data will keep expanding, unseen, unchallenged, and unstoppable.